The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting golden patterns across the marble floors. Princess Charlotte stood in her private chambers, her small hands trembling as she held a letter that had arrived just moments ago. The elegant handwriting belonged to her grandmother, but the words inside felt cold and distant. The palace was preparing for the annual royal garden party, an event where tradition dictated every movement, every word, and every smile. Charlotte was only 9 years old, but she carried responsibilities that most children her age could never imagine. Today, those responsibilities felt heavier than ever. The letter explained that she would need to perform a special ceremony during the garden party, one that required her to stand alone before hundreds of guests and recite an ancient oath in Latin. Her tutors had been preparing her for weeks, but something felt wrong. Every time she practiced the words, her throat tightened, and tears threatened to spill from her eyes. She walked slowly to her window and looked down at the palace gardens below. Gardeners were busy arranging white roses and trimming hedges into perfect shapes. Everything had to be perfect for the royal family. Nothing could be out of place. Charlotte pressed her forehead against the cool glass and wished, just for a moment, that she could be like the other children she sometimes saw playing in the park during her supervised outings. The door to her chamber opened softly, and her lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Patterson, entered with a gentle smile. She was an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mrs. Patterson had served the royal family for 30 years and had watched Charlotte grow from a baby into the thoughtful young girl she was today. "Your Royal Highness, it's time to prepare for your morning lessons," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice warm but formal. Charlotte turned from the window, quickly brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Mrs. Patterson noticed immediately, and her expression softened with concern. "Princess, is something troubling you?" Charlotte wanted to speak, wanted to tell Mrs. Patterson about the fear that gripped her heart, but the words stuck in her throat. She had been taught since birth that princesses did not complain. They did not show weakness. They served their country with grace and dignity, no matter what personal struggles they faced. So instead, Charlotte simply shook her head and forced a small smile onto her lips. "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. Just a bit tired from yesterday's engagements," Charlotte replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, clearly not convinced, but she did not press further. She simply nodded and helped Charlotte prepare for the day ahead. The morning lessons passed in a blur. Charlotte sat with her tutors, learning about history, mathematics, and diplomatic protocol. Her French tutor praised her accent, and her history instructor commended her knowledge of past monarchs. But inside, Charlotte felt like she was drowning. The weight of expectation pressed down on her small shoulders, making it hard to breathe. During her lunch break, Charlotte was supposed to eat in the formal dining room with her younger brother, Prince Louis, and their governess. But today she couldn't face the formal setting, the perfect table manners, and the constant reminders to sit up straight and use the correct fork. Instead, she asked if she could take a walk in the private garden, a request that was unusual but not forbidden. The guards stationed at the palace were accustomed to the royal family's routines, but they were also trained to notice when something was different. As Charlotte made her way through the corridors toward the garden entrance, she passed several guards standing at attention. They did not speak to her as protocol dictated, but their eyes followed her with quiet concern. Charlotte stepped into the garden and felt the warm afternoon sun on her face. The scent of roses filled the air, and for a moment she felt a small measure of peace. She walked along the stone paths, her shoes making soft clicking sounds against the ground. The garden was her favorite place in the entire palace because here, away from the formal rooms and watchful eyes, she could almost pretend to be normal. She found a quiet bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down, finally allowing herself to truly feel the emotions she had been holding back all day. The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Charlotte cried for the childhood she would never have, for the freedom she could never know, and for the terrible loneliness that came with being born into royalty. She didn't know how long she sat there crying, but eventually, she heard footsteps approaching on the gravel path. Charlotte quickly wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself, expecting to see Mrs. Patterson or another member of the household staff. But when she looked up, she saw someone different. Standing a respectful distance away was one of the royal guards. His name was James Mitchell, though Charlotte had never spoken to him directly. He was younger than most of the guards, perhaps in his late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle expression. He wore the traditional red uniform of the Queen's Guard, complete with the tall bearskin hat, but something about his posture seemed less rigid than the others. "Your Royal Highness," he said softly, bowing his head in respect. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was on patrol and wanted to ensure you were safe." Charlotte quickly stood up, smoothing down her dress and trying to look composed, even though she knew her eyes were red and puffy from crying. "I'm quite well, thank you," she said automatically, the practiced response coming easily after years of training. But James Mitchell did not immediately leave, as protocol would normally require. Instead, he remained standing there, his expression filled with genuine concern. "Forgive me, Princess, but you don't appear to be well. Is there anything I can do to help?" His words were simple, but they broke something inside Charlotte. Here was someone, a guard who was supposed to remain silent and invisible, asking if she needed help. It was so unexpected, so kind, that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I don't think anyone can help me," Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't want to be a princess. I just want to be me." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their honesty. Charlotte had never spoken these thoughts aloud to anyone, not even to her parents. She had just broken one of the most fundamental rules of royal life by revealing her true feelings to someone outside the immediate family. But instead of looking shocked or uncomfortable, James Mitchell simply nodded as if he understood completely. James Mitchell had served in the Royal Guard for 3 years, and in that time he had seen many things. He had stood at attention for hours in the rain, protected visiting dignitaries, and maintained perfect silence even when his feet ached and his back screamed for relief. But he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The young princess stood before him, tears streaming down her face, looking utterly lost and alone. Everything in his training told him to step back, to summon Mrs. Patterson or another appropriate member of the household staff. Guards were not supposed to engage in personal conversations with the royal family. They were meant to be invisible protectors, present but never intrusive. Yet something about the raw pain in Charlotte's eyes made him pause. She wasn't asking for special treatment or making unreasonable demands. She was simply a child who desperately needed someone to listen. "Your Royal Highness," James said gently, keeping his voice low and respectful. "May I speak freely for just a moment?" Charlotte nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand in a gesture that was so childlike it made James's heart ache. "I cannot pretend to understand what it's like to be in your position, but I do know that feeling trapped and alone is one of the hardest things a person can experience, and I want you to know that it's okay to feel what you're feeling." Charlotte looked up at him with surprise. No one had ever told her it was okay to feel sad or overwhelmed. She had always been taught to push those feelings down, to hide them behind a perfect smile and flawless manners. Hearing those words from this guard, someone who had no obligation to comfort her, felt like a lifeline being thrown to her in a stormy sea. "But I'm supposed to be strong," Charlotte said, her voice trembling. "Everyone expects me to be perfect all the time. Tomorrow I have to stand in front of hundreds of people and perform a ceremony that I don't even understand. I've practiced the words over and over, but every time I think about actually doing it, I feel like I can't breathe." James listened carefully, and then he did something that surprised both of them. He slowly removed his tall bearskin hat and set it carefully on the ground beside him. Without the imposing headpiece, he looked more human, more approachable. It was a small gesture, but it showed Charlotte that he was willing to break protocol to truly connect with her. "Would you like to know a secret, Princess?" James asked, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Charlotte nodded eagerly, grateful for any distraction from her anxiety. "Before I joined the Royal Guard, I was terrified of public speaking. Absolutely terrified. During my training, we had to give a speech in front of all the senior officers, and I was convinced I would fail." Charlotte's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "Well," James continued, settling into a more comfortable stance, "I tried to memorize every word perfectly, just like you're trying to do. But the more I practiced, the more anxious I became. The night before the speech, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about all the ways I might mess up, all the people who would be disappointed in me." "That's exactly how I feel," Charlotte admitted, relieved to hear that someone else understood her fear. "What happened when you gave your speech?" James chuckled softly. "I got up there, looked at all those stern faces staring at me, and my mind went completely blank. I couldn't remember a single word I had practiced. For a moment, I just stood there in complete silence, and I thought my career was over before it had even begun. Charlotte leaned forward, completely absorbed in his story. "Then what did you do?" I took a deep breath and decided to stop trying to be perfect. Instead of reciting the memorized speech, I just spoke from my heart. I told them why I wanted to serve, what the position meant to me, and how I hoped to honor the responsibility. The words weren't fancy or perfectly rehearsed, but they were true. And you know what? The officers were more impressed with that honest speech than they would have been with any perfectly memorized presentation. Charlotte thought about this for a long moment. The idea of speaking from her heart during the ceremony had never occurred to her. She had been so focused on getting every Latin word perfect, on not making any mistakes, that she had forgotten to think about what the ceremony actually meant. "But I have to say the words in Latin," Charlotte said, her hope dimming slightly. "It's tradition. I can't just change it." "You're right, you can't change the tradition," James agreed, "but you can change how you approach it. Instead of seeing those Latin words as a test you might fail, what if you thought of them as a gift you're giving to your country? You're connecting the present to the past, honoring your ancestors, and showing everyone that you care about your responsibilities." Charlotte considered this new perspective. When she thought about the ceremony as a gift rather than a burden, it felt different somehow. Less frightening and more meaningful. But still, the anxiety hadn't completely disappeared. "What if I still make a mistake?" she asked quietly. "What if I forget the words or say them wrong?" James smiled warmly. "Then you'll be human, just like everyone else. And I'll tell you another secret, Princess. The people who come to watch these ceremonies aren't hoping to see perfection. They're hoping to see heart. They want to feel connected to you, to see that you're a real person who cares about them. A small mistake won't matter nearly as much as the sincerity you bring to the moment." For the first time that day, Charlotte felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have to be perfect. Maybe she just had to be genuine. She looked at James with newfound curiosity. "Why are you being so kind to me? You could get in trouble for talking to me like this." James picked up his bearskin hat and held it in his hands, running his fingers along the dark fur, "because I believe that sometimes rules need to bend a little to make room for compassion. And because I have a younger sister about your age. If she were struggling and needed help, I would hope someone would be kind enough to stop and listen, even if it wasn't convenient or proper." Charlotte felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. These weren't tears of despair or loneliness. They were tears of gratitude and relief. Someone had seen her struggling and had chosen to help, even at personal risk. It was a simple act of kindness, but it meant everything to her. "Thank you," Charlotte said softly. "Thank you for stopping and for talking to me. I feel a little better now." James bowed respectfully. "I'm glad I could help, Your Royal Highness. And if I may offer one more piece of advice, remember that courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and doing what you need to do anyway. You have more courage than you know." As James prepared to leave and resume his patrol, Charlotte called out to him one more time. "Mr. Mitchell, would it be possible for you to be nearby during the ceremony tomorrow? I think it would help to see a friendly face in the crowd." James Mitchell looked at the young princess with gentle understanding. Her request was simple but complicated by the rigid structure of palace protocol. Guard assignments were determined by senior officers, and positions during royal ceremonies were carefully planned weeks in advance. Yet as he looked at Charlotte's hopeful face, he knew he had to try. "I'll do everything I can to be there, Princess," James promised. "I can't guarantee where I'll be positioned, but I'll request assignment to the garden party detail." Charlotte's face brightened considerably, and she managed a genuine smile for the first time that day. James replaced his bearskin hat, returned to his formal posture, and with a respectful bow, continued his patrol along the garden path. After James left, Charlotte remained on the bench for a few more minutes thinking about their conversation. The weight on her chest felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her fears had released some of the pressure. She thought about what James had said regarding speaking from the heart and showing courage even when afraid. These weren't just empty words of comfort. They felt true and real in a way that most of the formal advice she received did not. Eventually, Charlotte returned to the palace, where Mrs. Patterson was waiting with barely concealed worry. The older woman's face showed relief when she saw Charlotte approaching, though she was too professional to scold her for extending the garden walk without permission. "There you are, Princess. Your afternoon tutor is waiting in the study," Mrs. Patterson said, smoothing Charlotte's hair with maternal affection. She noticed that something about Charlotte seemed different, lighter perhaps, but she didn't pry. Charlotte nodded and followed Mrs. Patterson inside, feeling more prepared to face the rest of her day. That evening, after dinner with her family, Charlotte sat with her mother,
Catherine, in the private sitting room.
The room was warm and comfortable, decorated with family photographs and personal mementos that made it feel more like a home than a palace. Catherine was reviewing some documents, but she looked up when Charlotte entered and patted the cushion beside her on the sofa. "Come sit with me, darling," Catherine said with a warm smile. Charlotte settled next to her mother, feeling the comfort of her presence. Catherine set aside her papers and turned her full attention to her daughter. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you seemed a bit overwhelmed today. Do you want to talk about tomorrow's ceremony?" Charlotte hesitated, unsure how much to share. She didn't want to disappoint her mother or seem ungrateful for the opportunities her position provided, but she also remembered James's words about being honest and speaking from the heart. "Mom, do you ever feel afraid when you have to do something in public?" Charlotte asked carefully. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. She reached out and took Charlotte's hand in hers. "All the time, sweetheart. Even now, after years of public appearances, I still get nervous before big events. My hands shake and I worry about saying the wrong thing or making a mistake." Charlotte looked at her mother with surprise. "Really? But you always look so confident and perfect." "That's what people see on the outside," Catherine explained gently. "But inside, I'm just a person trying my best just like everyone else. The secret is that you don't have to feel confident to act confident. Sometimes you just have to take a deep breath and do what needs to be done, even when your heart is racing." "That's what someone told me today," Charlotte said quietly. "They said courage is about being afraid and doing things anyway." Catherine looked at her daughter with curiosity but didn't press for details about who had offered this wisdom. Instead, she wrapped her arm around Charlotte's shoulders and pulled her close. "That's absolutely right. And I want you to know something important, Charlotte. Tomorrow's ceremony is meaningful and special, but it's not the most important thing about you. Even if you stumble over the Latin words or forget a line, you're still my wonderful, kind, intelligent daughter. Nothing can change that." Tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes again, but these were happy tears. "I'm going to try my best, Mom, I really am. I just needed to know that it's okay if my best isn't perfect." "Your best is always more than enough," Catherine assured her. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, and then Catherine had an idea. "Would you like to practice the ceremony one more time? Not to make it perfect, but just to feel more familiar with it. I can be your audience, and we can make it feel less scary." Charlotte agreed, and they spent the next hour going through the ceremony in the informal setting of the sitting room. Catherine played the role of various guests, sometimes asking questions, sometimes applauding, sometimes just offering encouraging smiles. By the end of the practice, Charlotte felt much more comfortable with the words and the movements. More importantly, she felt supported and loved. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, James Mitchell was completing his shift report in the guard station. His supervisor, Captain Reynolds, was a strict but fair man who had served the royal family for 20 years. James approached him carefully, knowing that his request might seem unusual. "Captain Reynolds, sir, I'd like to request assignment to tomorrow's garden party detail," James said formally. Captain Reynolds looked up from his paperwork with surprise. The garden party detail was actually less desirable than other assignments because it required standing in the hot sun for hours, while guests mingled and enjoyed refreshments. That's an unusual request. "Mitchell, most guards try to avoid the garden parties. They're long and uncomfortable." "Any particular reason?" Captain Reynolds asked, studying James with keen eyes. James chose his words carefully. "I believe I can be most useful there, sir. I'm familiar with the layout of the garden, and I've noticed some security concerns in that area that I'd like to monitor more closely." It wasn't exactly a lie. James had noticed that the garden's many pathways and secluded corners did present certain security challenges. Captain Reynolds considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. You'll be positioned near the main pavilion where the ceremony will take place. Report at 600 hours for the pre-event briefing. And Mitchell, make sure you stay sharp out there. These garden parties may seem relaxed, but they require constant vigilance." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," James replied, relief flooding through him. He had kept his promise to Charlotte, and he would be there to offer whatever silent support he could during her difficult moment. That night, Charlotte lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling of her grand bedroom. The room was beautiful, decorated with fine fabrics and elegant furniture, but sometimes it felt more like a museum than a place where a child should sleep. She thought about everything that had happened that day, from her morning tears to her conversation with James to the practice session with her mother. For the first time, Charlotte realized that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was actually a sign of wisdom and strength. She had reached out to James in her moment of need, and he had responded with kindness. She had been honest with her mother, and Catherine had offered comfort and understanding. Tomorrow would still be challenging, but Charlotte no longer felt like she was facing it alone. The morning of the garden party arrived with brilliant sunshine and clear blue skies. Charlotte woke early, her stomach filled with butterflies. She could hear the distant sounds of preparations already underway in the gardens below her window. Staff members were setting up tables, arranging flowers, and ensuring every detail was perfect for the hundreds of guests who would soon arrive. Mrs. Patterson entered Charlotte's room with a breakfast tray, but Charlotte could barely eat. She managed a few bites of toast and sipped some orange juice, but her appetite had disappeared completely. Mrs. Patterson didn't force her to eat more, understanding that nerves had taken over. Instead, she helped Charlotte into a beautiful light blue dress that had been specially designed for the occasion. The dress was elegant but age-appropriate, with delicate embroidery along the hem and sleeves. As Charlotte sat at her dressing table, Mrs. Patterson gently brushed and styled her hair. The older woman worked with practiced hands, creating an elegant style that was both sophisticated and youthful. In the mirror, Charlotte could see her own reflection, but she hardly recognized herself. She looked like a proper princess, poised and ready for her public duty, but inside she still felt like a frightened little girl. "You look absolutely beautiful, Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you today." Charlotte managed a weak smile, though her hands were trembling slightly. Mrs. Patterson noticed and placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Remember, dear, everyone out there is on your side. They want you to succeed. They're not hoping for mistakes. They're hoping to witness a lovely moment." Charlotte nodded, trying to draw strength from Mrs. Patterson's words. She thought about what James had told her the previous day about seeing the ceremony as a gift rather than a test. She thought about her mother's reassurance that even if she made mistakes, she would still be loved and valued. These thoughts helped calm her racing heart, though they couldn't eliminate her nervousness entirely. Downstairs in the guards station, James Mitchell was completing his final preparations for the day. He had polished his boots until they gleamed, pressed his red uniform until every crease was sharp, and ensured his bearskin hat sat properly on his head. Captain Reynolds was conducting the morning briefing, reviewing security protocols and positioning assignments for all the guards on duty. "Mitchell, you'll be stationed at Position 7 near the main pavilion," Captain Reynolds announced, pointing to a location on the detailed map of the garden. "Keep your eyes on the crowd, watch for any unusual behavior, and maintain your post unless specifically called elsewhere. The ceremony will begin at 1100 hours precisely. Questions?" "No questions, sir," James responded crisply. Position 7 was exactly where he had hoped to be, close enough to the ceremony that Charlotte would be able to see him if she looked for a familiar face. He felt a sense of responsibility toward the young princess that went beyond his normal duties. Yesterday she had trusted him with her fears and vulnerabilities, and he wanted to honor that trust by being a steady presence for her today. By 10:30, guests were beginning to arrive at the palace. Cars and carriages pulled up to the main entrance, depositing well-dressed men and women who chatted excitedly about the opportunity to attend such an exclusive event. There were members of parliament, foreign dignitaries, prominent business leaders, and representatives from various charitable organizations. All had been carefully vetted and invited weeks in advance. Charlotte watched from her window as the gardens began to fill with people. The sight of so many strangers made her anxiety spike again. Her heart began racing and her palms grew sweaty. She pressed her hands against the cool window pane, trying to steady herself with deep breaths like her mother had taught her. A soft knock at her door announced her father's arrival. Prince William entered the room with a warm smile, immediately sensing his daughter's distress. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, looking down at the gathering crowd below. "Quite a lot of people down there," he observed gently, not minimizing her concerns. "I remember my first major public ceremony. I was about your age and I was convinced I would faint right in the middle of it." Charlotte looked up at her father with surprise. "You were scared too?" "Terrified," William admitted with a rueful smile. "My knees were shaking so badly I thought everyone could see. But my father, your grandfather, told me something that helped. He said that all those people gathering weren't there to judge me. They were there because they cared about our family and wanted to be part of something special. They were actually hoping I would do well. What if I let them down?" Charlotte asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if I forget the words or say them wrong? Everyone will think I'm not a good princess." William knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter. He took both of her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. "Charlotte, listen to me carefully. You could forget every single word, stand up there in complete silence, and I would still be proud of you for having the courage to try. Being a good princess isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, doing your best, and caring about the people you serve. You already do all of those things every single day." Charlotte felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back, not wanting to ruin Mrs. Patterson's careful work on her appearance. "I'm just so scared, Papa. I don't want to embarrass you or Mom or the whole family." "You could never embarrass us," William said firmly. "We love you unconditionally, Charlotte. Not because you're perfect, but because you're you. And I'll tell you a secret. Right before the ceremony begins, look toward the guard stationed near the left side of the pavilion. That's where I'll be watching from, just slightly to the side. If you get nervous or feel overwhelmed, just look at me. I'll be right there and you'll know you're not alone." Charlotte hugged her father tightly, drawing strength from his presence. "Thank you, Papa. I'll do my best. I promise I'll try to make you proud." "You already make me proud every day," William assured her. "Now are you ready? It's almost time." Charlotte took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. She was still nervous, but she no longer felt like she was facing an impossible task. She had support from her family, encouragement from James, and most importantly, she had found a small measure of courage within herself. The walk from her chambers to the garden felt both endless and too short. Charlotte moved through the palace corridors with Mrs. Patterson at her side, passing portraits of ancestors who had performed similar ceremonies in generations past. She wondered if they had felt the same fears and doubts, or if courage had come more easily to them. As they reached the entrance to the garden, Charlotte could hear the buzz of conversation from the assembled guests. Music played softly from a string quartet positioned near the refreshment tables. The scent of roses and lavender filled the air. Mrs. Patterson gave Charlotte's hand one final encouraging squeeze before stepping back to allow the princess to make her entrance alone. Charlotte stepped through the doorway and into the garden, and immediately hundreds of eyes turned to look at her. The moment Charlotte stepped into the garden, the gentle murmur of conversation faded to respectful silence. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her small shoulders. Her first instinct was to turn and run back inside, but she remembered her father's words and forced herself to keep walking along the designated path toward the pavilion. The garden had been transformed into something magical. White silk ribbons hung from tree branches, moving gently in the light breeze. Tables covered with pristine white cloths offered refreshments and treats to the guests. Flower arrangements in shades of pink, white, and yellow created splashes of color throughout the space. Everything looked perfect, like something from a fairy tale, but Charlotte felt like she was walking through a dream where her feet wouldn't quite move the way she wanted them to. As she walked, she heard whispers of admiration from the guests. "How lovely she looks," one woman murmured. "Such poise for one so young," commented a distinguished gentleman. These words should have comforted Charlotte, but instead they made her more nervous. What if she couldn't live up to their expectations? What if she proved to be a disappointment? Charlotte reached the pavilion, a beautiful white structure decorated with climbing roses and ivy. A small platform had been erected, and on it sat an ornate table with an ancient book containing the oath she needed to recite. Her grandmother's personal secretary, Mr. Thornberry, stood nearby, ready to assist if needed. He gave Charlotte a formal nod, his expression neutral and professional. Charlotte climbed the 3 steps to the platform, and the height made her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. From this elevated position, she could see the entire gathering. There were so many people, all dressed in their finest clothes, all watching her with anticipation. Her heart began to race faster, and her hands trembled as she approached the table. She needed to find something to focus on, some anchor to keep her from being swept away by panic. Her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for her father as he had promised. There, slightly to the left of the pavilion, she spotted him standing with her mother and brothers. William gave her a subtle nod of encouragement, and Catherine smiled warmly. Even little Louis, who usually fidgeted during formal events, was standing still and watching his sister with admiration. But Charlotte needed more. She continued scanning the area around the pavilion, and then she saw him. James Mitchell stood at his assigned position, looking straight ahead in the formal manner of the Royal Guard. His red uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but there was something about his presence that felt reassuring. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes shifted slightly toward her. And though his expression remained neutral, there was a warmth in his eyes that gave her strength. Mr. Thornbury stepped forward to begin the ceremony. "Your Royal Highnesses, honored guests, we gather here today to witness Princess Charlotte perform the ancient oath of service, a tradition that has been carried out by members of the royal family for over 300 years. This ceremony represents the commitment of each generation to serve the people with dedication, honor, and compassion." Charlotte's mouth felt dry, and she wished desperately for a glass of water. Mr. Thornbury opened the ancient book to the marked page and stepped back, indicating that it was time for Charlotte to begin. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. There was no more time to prepare, no more chances to practice. She either had to recite the oath or admit defeat in front of everyone. She looked down at the Latin text, and for a horrible moment, the words seemed to swim before her eyes. The letters blurred together, and she couldn't remember how to pronounce even the first word. Panic seized her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stood there in silence, and the seconds stretched out painfully. She could feel the confusion rippling through the crowd. Why wasn't she speaking? Had she forgotten? Was something wrong? Charlotte's mind raced, searching desperately for the words she had practiced 100 times. But fear had locked them away, and she couldn't find them no matter how hard she tried. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and she felt the terrible certainty that she was about to cry in front of everyone. The embarrassment would be unbearable. She would let down her entire family, fail in her duty, and prove to everyone that she wasn't worthy of her position. In that moment of desperation, Charlotte did something she had been taught never to do during a formal ceremony. She looked away from the book and directly at James Mitchell. The guard wasn't supposed to make eye contact with her during the ceremony, but he did. He held her gaze steadily, and then, very slowly and subtly, he placed his right hand over his heart. It was a gesture so small that probably no one else in the crowd even noticed it. But to Charlotte, it spoke volumes. James was reminding her of what he had said in the garden. Speak from your heart. The ceremony wasn't about perfect Latin pronunciation or flawless performance. It was about connection and meaning. It was about showing the people gathered here that she cared about them and took her responsibilities seriously. The ancient words were important, but the intention behind them was even more important. Charlotte took a deep breath and made a decision that would shock everyone present. Instead of trying to force out the Latin words that had escaped her memory, she closed the ancient book gently and stepped forward to the edge of the platform. She looked out at the assembled guests, no longer seeing them as a faceless crowd of expectations, but as individual people who had taken time out of their lives to be here for this moment. "I'm supposed to read you an oath in Latin today," Charlotte began, her voice small but clear. "I've practiced those words many times, and I know they're important because they connect me to all the princesses who came before me. But right now, standing here in front of all of you, I realize that what matters most isn't saying the perfect words in an ancient language. What matters is that you know I mean them." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Mr. Thornbury looked alarmed, unsure whether to intervene. This was not how the ceremony was supposed to go. Royal protocols were being broken. Tradition was being shattered. But Prince William held up a subtle hand, signaling the secretary to wait and let Charlotte continue. "I'm only 9 years old," Charlotte continued, her confidence growing slightly as she spoke from her heart. "And sometimes being a princess feels really scary. There are so many rules to follow and so many people counting on me to be perfect. But yesterday someone told me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. So I'm standing here, even though I'm nervous because I want to serve you all to the best of my ability." Catherine pressed a hand to her heart, tears glistening in her eyes. She had never been more proud of her daughter than she was at this moment. William stood very still, afraid that any movement might break the spell of Charlotte's honest words. Around the garden, guests were leaning forward, completely captivated by the young princess's unexpected speech. "The oath in this old book promises that I'll be dedicated and compassionate and honorable," Charlotte said, gesturing to the closed volume behind her. "And I want to make that same promise to you in words I truly understand. I promise to always try my best even when things are difficult. I promise to care about people and try to help when I can. I promise to keep learning and growing so I can serve you better. And I promise to be honest even when honesty is scary." Charlotte paused, her eyes finding James again in the crowd. He remained at attention, but she could see something in his expression that looked like pride and encouragement. She took another deep breath and continued, "I know I'm going to make mistakes sometimes. I'm still learning and there's so much I don't know yet. But I promise that when I make mistakes, I'll learn from them and try to do better. And I hope that you'll all be patient with me as I grow into the person I need to become." The garden was completely silent. Not a single person moved or whispered. Charlotte had captured everyone's attention in a way that no perfect Latin recitation ever could have. She had shown them her authentic self, vulnerable and honest and brave, and it was more powerful than any ancient ceremony. So today, instead of reading words I've memorized, "I'm giving you my word as Charlotte," she concluded, her voice strengthening. "I will serve you with all my heart. I will honor the responsibility I've been given. And I will always remember that being a princess isn't about being perfect. It's about caring deeply and trying honestly." Charlotte stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Had she done the right thing? Would people be angry that she had broken tradition? Would her grandmother be disappointed? The silence stretched on, and Charlotte felt her courage beginning to waver. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause that cut through the silence. Within seconds, others joined in, and soon the entire garden erupted in applause. It wasn't polite ceremonial clapping. It was genuine, enthusiastic applause that spoke of real appreciation and admiration. Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise. She had expected disapproval or disappointment, but instead she was receiving something far more valuable. She was receiving acceptance. The guests weren't applauding a perfect performance. They were applauding her courage, her honesty, and her heart. Prince William couldn't contain himself any longer. He stepped forward from his position and climbed the platform steps to stand beside his daughter. He placed a proud hand on her shoulder and smiled down at her with such love and approval that Charlotte felt her earlier fears dissolve completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," William addressed the crowd, his voice thick with emotion, "you have just witnessed something far more meaningful than any scripted ceremony. You have seen true courage and genuine dedication. My daughter has shown us all that tradition is not about rigid adherence to form, but about understanding and honoring the spirit of what those traditions represent. I am immensely proud of her." The applause swelled again, and Charlotte felt tears streaming down her cheeks. But these were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and accomplishment. She had faced her greatest fear and discovered that being authentic was far more powerful than being perfect. As the applause finally began to fade, Catherine joined her husband and daughter on the platform. She wrapped Charlotte in a warm embrace, whispering in her ear, "You were magnificent, darling. Absolutely magnificent." Charlotte hugged her mother tightly, feeling safe and loved and valued in a way she had never quite felt before. Mr. Thornberry approached cautiously, clearly unsure how to proceed, given the dramatic departure from protocol. But William simply smiled at him and said, "I believe the ceremony is complete, Mr. Thornberry, perhaps more complete than it has ever been." The secretary nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his own lips despite his usual stern demeanor. After the ceremony concluded, the garden party continued in a much more relaxed and joyful atmosphere than anyone had expected. The guests mingled freely, sipping champagne and tea while discussing the remarkable moment they had just witnessed. Charlotte could hear snippets of conversation as she moved through the crowd with her parents, and she was surprised to hear how positively people were responding. "That was the most genuine thing I've seen at a royal event in decades," one elderly gentleman said to his companion. The girl has real character, not just practiced manners. A group of ladies near the rose garden were equally enthusiastic. She spoke from her heart. That takes more courage than any memorized speech, one of them commented warmly. Charlotte stayed close to her parents, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She shook hands with dozens of guests, each of whom offered congratulations and praise. Many of them told her how much her honesty had moved them. Some shared their own stories of overcoming fear and finding courage in difficult moments. Charlotte listened to each person, beginning to understand that her vulnerability had created a genuine connection with people in a way that a perfect performance never could have. But amid all the attention and celebration, Charlotte hadn't forgotten about James. She kept glancing toward his position near the pavilion, wanting to thank him properly for the support he had provided. However, royal protocol made it impossible for her to approach him directly during the event. Guards were meant to remain invisible, and it would be highly unusual for a princess to single out one guard for special attention in front of hundreds of guests. As the afternoon wore on, Charlotte's younger brother Louis tugged at her dress. "Charlie, that was really brave what you did," he said, using the family nickname he had given her when he was learning to talk. "I was scared for you when you closed the book, but then you talked and everyone loved it." Charlotte smiled down at her little brother. "Thank you, Lou. I was scared too, but I'm glad I did it." Louis hugged her enthusiastically before running off to investigate the dessert table, his brief attention span already moving on to more interesting things like cakes and pastries. Charlotte's grandmother, who had been unable to attend due to health concerns, sent word through Mr. Thornberry that she wished to speak with Charlotte privately after the event. This message filled Charlotte with renewed anxiety. Had her grandmother been watching somehow? Was she upset about the broken tradition? Charlotte's stomach twisted with worry, but she tried to focus on the present moment and enjoy what remained of the garden party. As the sun began to lower in the sky, guests started to depart. They thanked their hosts, complimented the beautiful setting, and many specifically sought out Charlotte to offer one more word of praise before leaving. Charlotte's face ached from smiling, and her feet hurt from standing in her formal shoes for so long, but she maintained her composure until the last guest had departed. Finally, only family and staff remained in the garden. The string quartet had packed up their instruments, and workers were beginning to clean up the remnants of the celebration. Charlotte slipped off her uncomfortable shoes and wiggled her toes in the grass, sighing with relief. Catherine laughed and did the same, and for a moment they were just a mother and daughter enjoying a quiet moment together. "You need to go speak with grandmother now," William reminded Charlotte gently. "She's waiting for you in her study." Charlotte's anxiety returned full force. She had been dreading this conversation throughout the entire party. She slowly put her shoes back on and followed her father into the palace, her earlier confidence evaporating with each step. They walked through the familiar corridors to her grandmother's private study, a room filled with books, family photographs, and mementos from decades of royal service. William knocked softly on the door, and a voice from within called for them to enter. He opened the door but didn't follow Charlotte inside. "You've got this," he whispered encouragingly, before gently guiding her forward and closing the door behind her. Charlotte's grandmother sat in an elegant chair near the fireplace, even though no fire was needed on this warm day. She was dressed formally as always, and her posture was perfectly straight despite her advanced age. She looked at Charlotte with an expression that was difficult to read. "Come here, child," her grandmother said, gesturing to a chair across from her. Charlotte crossed the room on shaky legs and sat down, folding her hands in her lap the way she had been taught. For a long moment, her grandmother simply studied her, and Charlotte couldn't tell if she was about to be praised or scolded. "I watched the ceremony through the window," her grandmother finally said. "I was too unwell to attend, but Mr. Thornberry arranged for me to observe from my sitting room." Charlotte nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You broke tradition today, Charlotte. You closed the book containing an oath that has been recited in Latin by every princess in our family for 3 centuries. Do you understand the significance of what you did?" "Yes, grandmother," Charlotte whispered. "I'm sorry if I disappointed you. I tried to remember the words, but when I stood up there, everything I had practiced just disappeared. I was so scared and I didn't know what else to do." Her grandmother leaned forward slightly. "Did I say I was disappointed?" she asked. and Charlotte detected something unexpected in her voice. It almost sounded like amusement. "Child, look at me." Charlotte raised her eyes to meet her grandmother's gaze and was shocked to see warmth and approval there. "What you did today took remarkable courage," her grandmother continued. "You could have stood there in silence or fled the platform in tears or pushed through with a stumbling memorized recitation. Instead, you chose authenticity. You showed those people your real self, and in doing so you gave them something far more valuable than any ceremonial words." Charlotte's eyes widened with surprise. "You're not upset?" "Upset? No, child. I'm proud," her grandmother said firmly. "Do you know why those Latin oaths were created in the first place? They were meant to demonstrate the commitment and dedication of the royal family to the people, but over centuries they became more about preserving tradition than conveying meaning. What you did today brought back the true purpose of the ceremony. You showed real commitment, real dedication, and real humanity." Tears of relief spilled down Charlotte's cheeks. "I was so worried you would think I failed." Her grandmother's expression softened further. "Charlotte, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. When I performed that same ceremony at your age, I was absolutely terrified. I did manage to recite the Latin words, but I stumbled over them badly, and I had no idea what I was actually saying. I was just parroting sounds I had memorized. Afterward, I felt empty and disappointed in myself. I wished I had been brave enough to speak from my heart the way you did today." Charlotte stared at her grandmother in amazement. The idea that this strong, composed woman had once felt the same fears and doubts she had experienced seemed almost impossible. "You were scared too?" Charlotte asked softly. "Terrified," her grandmother confirmed with a small smile. "And I've been scared many times since then. Fear doesn't go away when you get older, Charlotte. You simply learn to work with it, rather than letting it control you. Today you learned that lesson much earlier than I did, and for that you have my admiration." They talked for a while longer, and Charlotte's grandmother shared stories from her own childhood, moments of doubt and difficulty that had never been made public. She spoke about the pressure of expectations, the loneliness of royal life, and the constant struggle to balance duty with personal happiness. These honest revelations made Charlotte feel less alone and helped her understand that every member of the royal family, past and present, had faced their own challenges. "Before you go, I want to give you something," her grandmother said, rising slowly from her chair. She crossed to an antique desk and opened a drawer, removing a small velvet box. She returned to Charlotte and placed it in her hands. "Open it." Inside the box was a delicate gold bracelet with a single charm in the shape of a heart. "This belonged to my mother," her grandmother explained. "She gave it to me when I was about your age, after I had made a difficult decision that went against what everyone expected of me. She told me that following your heart takes more courage than following rules. I want you to have it now, as a reminder of what you accomplished today." Charlotte's fingers trembled as she lifted the bracelet from the box. The gold caught the light, and the heart charm seemed to glow warmly. "Thank you, grandmother. I'll treasure it always." Her grandmother helped fasten the bracelet around Charlotte's wrist and then pulled her into a rare embrace. "I love you, my brave girl. Never forget that being true to yourself is the greatest gift you can give to those you serve." When Charlotte finally left her grandmother's study, she felt transformed. The weight that had been pressing on her shoulders for days had lifted completely. She felt lighter, freer, and more confident than she had in a long time. As she walked through the corridors back toward her chambers, she knew there was one more thing she needed to do. Charlotte found Mrs. Patterson and asked for her help with an unusual request. She wanted to thank James Mitchell personally for his kindness. Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain, explaining that such interactions were highly irregular, but Charlotte's determination convinced her. After some consideration, Mrs. Patterson agreed to arrange a brief, properly chaperoned meeting in one of the formal reception rooms. 20 minutes later, James Mitchell entered the small reception room looking surprised and slightly nervous. He had been preparing to end his shift when Captain Reynolds informed him that Princess Charlotte had requested his presence. He couldn't imagine what this was about, though he hoped desperately that his conversation with her in the garden hadn't caused any problems. Charlotte was waiting with Mrs. Patterson standing discreetly near the door. When James entered, he bowed formally. "Your Royal Highness, you asked to see me?" "Yes, Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming," Charlotte said, her voice much steadier than it had been the previous day. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday in the garden. When I was crying and scared, you stopped and talked to me even though you didn't have to. You helped me see things differently, and because of that, I found the courage to be honest today during the ceremony." James looked genuinely touched. "Your Royal Highness, I'm honored that my words helped, but the courage was already inside you. You just needed a reminder of where to find it." Charlotte smiled and took a step closer. "My grandmother once told me that the people who help us during our hardest moments are gifts we should never forget. So I wanted to make sure you knew how grateful I am. You treated me like a person, not just a princess, and that meant everything to me." "It was my privilege, Princess Charlotte," James replied sincerely. "If I may say so. What you did today at the ceremony was extraordinary. You showed everyone that authenticity and vulnerability can be strengths, not weaknesses. That's a lesson many adults never learn." Charlotte reached up and touched the bracelet her grandmother had given her. "Someone else told me something similar just a little while ago. I'm starting to understand that being royal doesn't mean being perfect. It means being genuine and caring about people." "That's exactly right," James agreed. "And from what I witnessed today, you're going to be an exceptional leader someday, Your Royal Highness." They talked for a few more minutes, and then Mrs. Patterson gently indicated that it was time to conclude the meeting. Charlotte thanked James once more, and he bowed respectfully before leaving the room. That evening, the family gathered for a private dinner in their personal dining room. The formal atmosphere of the garden party had been replaced with comfortable warmth and genuine celebration. Louis entertained everyone with his energetic retelling of the day's events, complete with dramatic gestures. Charlotte's older brother George, who had watched the ceremony with quiet pride, told Charlotte that she had been braver than anyone he knew. As they ate, William raised his glass in a toast. "To Charlotte, who reminded us all today that tradition should serve people, not the other way around. You showed tremendous courage, sweetheart, and you made us all incredibly proud." Everyone clinked glasses, and Charlotte felt surrounded by love and support. Later that night, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she reflected on everything that had happened over the past 2 days. She thought about her moment of despair in the garden, her conversation with James, her mother's encouragement, her father's support, and her grandmother's unexpected approval. She realized that asking for help hadn't made her weak. It had connected her with people who cared about her and wanted to support her. She looked at the gold bracelet on her wrist and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but she felt ready to face them differently now. She understood that she didn't have to carry every burden alone or pretend to be perfect. She could be honest about her struggles, ask for support when needed, and trust that being genuine was far more valuable than any flawless performance. Charlotte climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. Through her window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about all the people who had helped her today, from James Mitchell's kindness to her parents' unwavering support, to her grandmother's surprising wisdom. She had learned that courage wasn't about facing challenges alone. It was about being brave enough to let others help you and honest enough to show your true self to the world. As sleep began to claim her, Charlotte made a silent promise to herself. She would remember this day whenever future challenges arose. She would remember that breaking tradition to honor truth was sometimes the bravest choice. She would remember that vulnerability could be a strength. And most importantly, she would remember that she was never truly alone, even in her scariest moments. The next morning, news of Charlotte's unscripted ceremony had spread throughout the kingdom. Newspapers ran headlines praising her courage and authenticity. Social media buzzed with positive comments from people who had been moved by her honest words. Many said they felt more connected to the royal family than ever before because Charlotte had shown them something real and relatable. In the guard station, James Mitchell read the news coverage with quiet satisfaction. He had done a small thing, stopped to comfort a frightened child, and it had contributed to something much larger. Captain Reynolds approached him that morning with an unusual expression. "Mitchell, I've received several commendations about your conduct during the garden party," Captain Reynolds said. "Apparently the princess spoke very highly of your character to her family." "Well done." James felt pride swell in his chest, not because of the recognition, but because he had made a difference in a young girl's life when she needed it most. Charlotte's story became more than just a royal ceremony gone differently than planned. It became a lesson that resonated with people far beyond the palace walls. Parents told their children about the brave princess who chose honesty over perfection. Teachers used her example to encourage students to be authentic. People from all walks of life found inspiration in the idea that showing vulnerability could create genuine connections. For Charlotte herself, the experience marked a turning point. She still had duties and responsibilities, still had to attend formal events and follow royal protocols. But she approached these tasks with a new understanding. She knew now that she could be both a princess and herself. She didn't have to choose between duty and authenticity. She could honor her responsibilities while staying true to her heart. Years later, when people asked Charlotte about that day, she would smile and say it was the day she learned the most important lesson of her life. She learned that courage comes in many forms, that asking for help is a sign of wisdom, and that breaking tradition to serve a higher truth is sometimes the most honorable choice of all. And she would touch the gold bracelet on her wrist, remembering the scared little girl in the garden who found the strength to